Hey guys, I wanted to make a video talking about the things that we learned with the oil system in this car and some of the things that we found that were quite interesting. So stick around and see what we learned, and maybe you'll be able to apply it to your build. All of the information you're going to hear is specific to this car and what we found. This does not mean it's going to apply to you and your car. It does not mean you have to change what you are doing. I don't want to be one of the other people out there that says you have to have this. This is what we found from actual experience here in the shop. At the same time, it may not be true for you. It was true for us. We fixed the problem, but it may not be true for you. So take it with a grain of salt and enjoy the video. So we had a lot of issues last year with this car. We kept going through rod bearings. We went through them in about 3 or 4 hits on the dyno. We would start to see material in the clear view. I learned a lot, and I just wanted to share some of that with you because there seems to be a lot of information on the internet about what you need to do to make an oil system in an RV work. And I knew very little, right? I mean, just so the first engine we put together just worked. And when something just works, you don't really learn what stuff does. Like I said, after about 3 or 4 hits, we were able to start seeing material in the filter. And occasionally we would make a 5th hit just to be sure. And then material, you know, the size of the shreds of bearing material would increase. So we knew that at that point we had to take the engine apart. So we did all of this with the engine in the car. The first 2 iterations, the engine did come out because those bearings actually did get trashed, and we refreshed it and rebuilt it. And then eventually, once we put the clear view on, we modified the oil pan so that we could just take the pan on and off the car, and that made the process a lot quicker. And we weren't trashing bearings, but we were able to see that they were touching the crank. So for the people that think that you have to tear the engine, or I should have teared the engine apart every single time and cleaned every single part, yes, you are correct. I probably should have done that, but it would never have gotten done. We would never have been able to actually solve the problem because this all would have just taken way too long. I'll put a picture up of what the bearings look like. And so these are about 3 or 4 hits on the dyno, and they all look like this every single time. All 6 rod bearings. There was not one bearing that was picked on. There was not one that was different than the rest. It was rod side and cap side, both look the same. And there weren't continuous scores the whole way around, which is what would happen if there was trash going through the engine. All right, so some of the things that we did to the car to either correct the oil pressure trace, which had an arc to it. It didn't go up and stay flat. It did go up, and then it would drop about 15 to 20 pounds from 6,500 RPM to 9,300 RPM. Some of the things that we did to correct that, some of the things that we did to increase oil pressure, and some of the things that we did to correct what we thought were oil pump cavitation or foamy oil, unfortunately did absolutely nothing. And it was quite interesting to see what did nothing, because all of the stuff that we put on it did nothing. And the problem wasn't really related to any of that at all. So the engines that we have been building, and the engine that was originally in this that lasted forever, 3 years, was just a standard 26 block, no brace, N1 pump with spool aftermarket gears for the spline drive. And I've been putting 1.3 restrictors in the head, left the oil squirters alone, no head drain. And that's just how the car ran, and it ran for a very long time. And it ended up, we took the engine apart because it failed by splitting a bore. It had nothing to do with the oil system. When we put it back together, that's when we ran into the rod bearing problems, and we didn't change anything. We did change stuff, but we didn't change anything with the oiling system. And that's what made the whole problem so difficult. So this caused us to change 1 part at a time, or maybe 2 parts at a time, and see what actually happens inside the engine with either the oil pressure trace, the rod bearing life, and the condition of the rod bearings after the same amount of hits on the dyno. And it was pretty eye-opening, I'll say that. So I'm going to list off some of the things that we did, and I probably will forget some. I don't have an actual list in front of me, but some of the things that we did to either correct the oil pressure trace or just try to get the rod bearings to live were increase oil pressure from about 80 pounds to 140 pounds. We blocked off the oil squirters. I put a smaller restrictor in the cylinder head from a 1.3 down to a 1.1. I put a head drain on it. I put a factory windage tray back into the sump, which has a lot of nice louvers and like fins and grooves to try to catch oil and direct it back down to the pickup. Put a rudimentary crank scraper on it. Ported the oil pump pretty heavily. Billet backing plate. On the oil pickup itself, there's a plate with a little slot in it, and that's kind of the first entrance that the oil has, is it drawn up into the pickup. I opened that up, and then I ended up cutting that whole plate off, so it was just an open screen, thinking that that was a restriction. Reduced timing, ignition timing from 3000 on to 9300 to 10 degrees. Top dead center was confirmed. The car was a complete dog, and it still put material in the filter. Different oil weights, so we did 530, 1040, straight 30 weight with high zinc. We did 2050 with high zinc, which was the oil that the engine had initially on the engine that lasted for 3 years. We did that 1060 synthetic. Increased bearing clearances on the rod bearings from 2.5 thousandths to 3 thousandths. Full groove main bearings to hopefully supply the rods with oil at all times. And I'm sure there's more, but that's all I can remember now. But nevertheless, all of those items that I just listed did absolutely nothing at all to either the oil pressure trace or to the rod bearing life. So I mentioned the oil pressure trace because I had maybe an impression that it was the oil pressure falling off was reducing the oil pressure to the rod bearings, and thus they were failing or starting to fail. But no matter what we did, we could not correct it. And so I started looking at lots of data logs of all the cars that I've tuned remotely, tuned here, whether they're built here, whether they're stock engines, this car when it was a stock engine, other cars that were stock, other engines built elsewhere. Every single car does the same exact thing with the oil pressure trace. It'll go up to 6,500 and then it'll fall out. Now, none of those cars are spun to 9,300. They all stop around 8,000 or 8,200. But so the oil pressure drop off isn't as significant, but it's still doing that same arc. So anyway, all of those items that we put on the car, unfortunately, made no changes whatsoever to oil pressure trace or to the bearing life, which was a big bummer because that was a lot of iterations to get through all of those. And a lot of times with the oil pan off and a lot of bearing replacements. And it was very frustrating. It was very depressing. And it was also very eye-opening because you read about this stuff being needed or have to have, or it will do this or it will do that. And quite honestly, on this car, none of those things did anything. And I'm glad that we got to learn that. I'm glad that we got to see that in real life. And so we have data now to show what we found, and we also have real life experience to prove that stuff didn't do anything. And I guess it was worth it for that. I'm trying to justify it to myself there, but yeah, it definitely was eye-opening. So we did all of this stuff and nothing made a difference. So what we ended up doing was kind of, we went and dug through some old drives to find the pictures of when the engine that lasted for 3 years came apart, to see what the rod bearings looked like and see what color they were, because I was trying to find what bearings I initially had in that engine. And it looked like from the pictures that they're ACL bearings. What I had been putting in the car since the first rebuild after splitting the bore were King XP bearings. And the reason that we switched to Kings was simply because at the time, 2020, 2021, it was so hard to get parts, and ACL bearings were non-existent in the country. We could not find them anywhere, and Kings were available. So quite honestly, I didn't think anything of it. We switched and put the Kings in it. We've run King bearings in many other engines and haven't had an issue. And I even had contacted some other engine builders who do build RB26s quite regularly, and they said we'll use King or ACL interchangeably. So I really didn't think anything of it. And this is, I guess, where you where you start to learn things and don't necessarily want to learn these things. So we put the Kings in it. We had all these issues, and the whole time I thought, it was kind of in the back of my head, like, should I just put ACLs back in it? And then it kind of, you talk to people and they say, and you think that it just reasonably makes sense. What could it matter what the bearing material is? If there's oil between the bearing and the crankshaft journal, who cares what the material is or who makes the bearing, I should say. And I believed that. I really did, because it made sense. But we did all those iterations. We changed all that stuff that I mentioned. Nothing made a difference. So it was kind of like a Hail Mary. I mean, I was really ready to park the car out, and because I couldn't figure this out, and I was like, this is it. I'm done. Like, I really don't know what else to do, and I'm kind of tired of working on this. And this whole thing is happening over the course of about 2 years now. And the last probably 10 iterations were over the course of maybe 3 or 4 months, thanks to the fact that we could easily get the pan off and we had a clear view filter. Anyway, so we pulled the pan back off, reverted all changes except for a couple things like the oil squirters and the cylinder head restrictor, because those aren't really able to be easily changed with just the pan off. So the windage tray all went back, everything else went back, removed the head drain, and put ACL bearings into it and returned the clearances back to where they were at about 2.5 thousandths on the rod bearings. Everything back to stock. So except I also had been told, hey, why don't you try putting a second pickup on the oil pump? And at this time I was still wondering about cavitation. So we did a second oil pickup, and I'll show a picture of what that looks like. And so it has the factory oil pump draws through the factory pickup, and now it also draws through a -12 line that runs outside the engine and down into the sump. And I also hogged out the inlet tube on the oil pump. So it's a reasonably small diameter from factory, and now that it has to draw through 2 pickups, or 2 pickups are being used, I thought that it would be a good idea to open that up. So opened it up about 1/8 of an inch in diameter at the end, and then where the gears were actually next down, so that might have been opened up 3/16 of an inch, quite a lot. So smoothed all out, poured the oil pump again a little bit, cleaned it all up, put it all back together, really expecting that if there was cavitation on these oil pumps, that I would see some evidence of oil pressure not dropping off. And I didn't, unfortunately. The second pickup did seem to do is, prior to the peak, it reached that peak much faster. So instead of like an arc going up to 6,500 RPM, it would very steeply went to the peak oil pressure and held that to 6,500 RPM. And then it dropped off that same amount, exactly the same as it had before. So from that, I don't believe that the N1 pump cavitates at 8,000 RPM. I believe that if it was cavitation, or that the pump was cavitating, there would be some increase in oil pressure above 6,500 RPM with the 2 pickups and the oil inlet on the pump significantly drilled out. And there wasn't. It made no difference whatsoever. So from that, and paired with all of the other things that we learned that did nothing, I am concluding that the oil is just getting so full of air and so foamy, and unfortunately the windage modifications we did just didn't do anything. But it's still so full of air that once you reach 8,000 RPM or so, it's not cavitating the oil pump. It's still pumping oil, but the oil is so foamy that's why we see the pressure drop, and that's also why we see the bearings start to touch the crankshaft. However, with the ACL bearings in, the problem is gone. We made about 6 hits on the dyno, and no material, and then turned the boost pressure up to about 30 pounds and made another hit or 2, and no material in the filter, clean as can be. Went to the track, made a few test hits, and no material in the filter. Drove it around on the street, making test hits, test launches, just driving it, spinning it up to 9,300, and no material in the filter. Went to another track event, made about 2 test hits, ran out of time, but still no material in the filter. So I do believe the problem is solved And I think from what we found, my conclusion is that yes, the oil is so foamy, it's pumping foamy oil through the engine. There's nothing you can do about it. No oil pump is going to prevent the oil from getting foamy. No high volume oil pump is going to make a difference. Increasing the oil pressure doesn't matter because it's still foamy oil. You would have to significantly cut down on that windage, and you can't. I don't know if you can do that on a factory sump. We did quite a lot of stuff, and it doesn't seem to make a difference. Anyway, it's foamy oil. It's getting pumped through the engine. It gets out to the rod bearing, and the rod bearing is going to touch the crankshaft. And I think what was happening is we had these King XP bearings, which are supposed to be a very hard bearing. I know this now. I did not know it before this whole debacle. And then we have the ACL race series bearings, which are supposed to be a much softer bearing than the Kings. They're supposed to be a little harder than stock, but softer than the Kings significantly. This is what I'm told by the bearing companies. Obviously, I can't confirm this. I didn't do any hardness testing or anything like that. But when the hard King bearing touches the crankshaft because there's foamy oil and it's not doing a good job of keeping that bearing off the crankshaft, it touches down and it just starts to come apart. It starts to fail, and it may not be because it's hard. It may be because of the material they use. I have no idea. But it fails. It starts to come apart very quickly. The ACL bearing, however, I'm quite sure it's still touching the crankshaft, but it is of a soft, maybe the material they use or the fact that it's softer does not matter. It just slides right along the crankshaft journal or the rod journal, and it doesn't come apart. It doesn't have any material come apart. So I think that it's very important to run a soft bearing in these engines. So it was a lot of work, and I'm justifying it by saying we learned a lot. Going forward, obviously we'll be putting the soft bearings in. And I should say we've built engines with both the Kings and the ACLs in the past. And those engines we usually just spin up to $8,000. They make about 450 to 500 horsepower. And we cut the filters open after every car gets off the dyno to inspect how the session went, and every single one of those cars has been perfectly fine, perfectly clean oil, filters. And we recently had one of those cars back here, and it was in the middle of all of this, and I cut the filter open on that car. It had been gone for about 1.5 years or so of him driving it and beating on it and just enjoying it. And I cut the filter open on it, and it was perfectly fine. It was still perfectly fine. So it has something to do with either high RPM or a significant amount of power, and that foamy oil just can no longer support the rod bearing. And yeah, so going forward, obviously we'll be putting ACL bearings and everything. I would highly suggest that you guys do that too if you are building your engine. Use the ACLs. I think we'll use coated ACLs because we did find in one of our tests that coated bearings do a very good job of just glancing right off the crankshaft when they do touch. But they're coated King XP bearings, so they're still hard, and I wanted to really solve the problem. I didn't want to modify something that I didn't have to do before and not really know what the problem was. So we took the coated bearings back out and switched to the ACLs. So a coated ACL is probably the ticket because coating obviously works very well. If you have any questions, shoot me a message, send an email to the shop, give us a call. I'd be totally fine with discussing if you're having similar problems and you want to know a bit more in detail about what we found or what we did and what we learned. So more than willing to help out. I definitely don't want someone going through what we had to go through, and I'll help as much as I can. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Take care.